In this lecture, we'll be looking at learning. So first, we'll start with orienting reflex and habituation. So learning is basically us acquiring understanding, knowledge, behavior, skills, values, attitudes, and preferences through various experiences. It's a relatively permanent change in behavior or potential behavior, which is your likelihood of engaging in a behavior in a given experience. What can happen is orienting reflex. So we stop what we are doing to orient our senses towards unexpected stimuli. This is to assist us with self-protection. For example, you hear a loud noise such as thunder in the distance or someone dropping something, and you stop to assess the situation and basically dictate if any action is needed to protect yourself. We can also learn through habituation, so as a stimulus persists over time, we tend to respond less and less to it. You basically learn to ignore something. So the thunder outside continues, you'll probably ignore it and try to tune it out. Or possible benefits of habituation could include your body's ensuring you don't waste energy or mental resources on irrelevant stimuli. Otherwise, we would respond to every single thing we encounter every single time we encounter it. We also might be ignoring stimuli that has been deemed harmless by us, and it can protect our brains from overstimulation and protect our nervous system from sensory overload. Now, some individuals struggle with habituation, such as those living with ADHD. The brain tends to focus on irrelevant stimuli very easily due to distractibility, and you get overstimulation and sensory overload. A practical application, though, of habituation is commonly seen in exposure therapy. Clients are repeatedly exposed to stimuli that induces fear or anxiety, and they learn to manage the accompanying thoughts, emotions, and behaviors so they can better manage those triggers. You see this a lot, usually with OCD. But there is dishabituation, so a response that has been habituated to, or something we've started to ignore, is basically restored or enhanced by the introduction of a new or different stimulus or the passage of time. So maybe you have habituated to the thunder outside. You've started to ignore it, so you're no longer looking out your window. However, maybe you hear thunder hitting a tree. That sound is different enough that it prompts you to look out the window again. Your response could be enhanced by you feeling startled or slightly jumping, or the thunderstorm stops and you begin again a few hours later, so you habituate to the thunder all over again. But the habituation will most likely not take as long in that instance. So one way we learn is through classical conditioning, which was greatly influenced by a man named Pavlov. So this stems from an experiment Pavlov did with a dog to look at how salivation impacts digestion. However, he noticed a learning process. He saw that the dog would salivate when presented food, and that the dog started salivating before the food was presented, because the dog started associating certain stimuli, such as the sound of footsteps, with the presentation of food. Eventually, Pavlov was able to condition the dog to salivate when it heard a bell ring. So, classical conditioning is this type of learning where a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus, and then the neutral stimulus becomes what we call a conditioned stimulus. And this new conditioned stimulus elicits a response. So, what are these stimuli? First, we'll start with unconditioned stimulus, or US. This is a stimulus that naturally brings about an automatic response. It's not conditioned. So, there's a cold breeze and you automatically shiver or get goosebumps. A neutral stimulus is one that does not elicit an unconditioned response naturally or automatically. So you might hear a fan, but you don't feel a breeze. So therefore, you wouldn't trigger shivering or goosebumps. Now, a conditioned stimulus, CS, is that neutral stimulus, the one that's not producing naturally or automatically a response. It gets paired with an unconditioned stimulus, the stimulus that naturally brings about a certain response. And the stimulus that was once neutral now leads to a conditioned response. So you pair the sound of a fan with a very cold breeze that elicits shivering and goosebumps enough times that you now have this response every time you'll hear a fan. So this response actually shows up a lot in our day-to-day lives, whether it's with video games, our phones, or even food poisoning. Now, there are some influences on the classical conditioning learning process. One of them is contiguity, so that's how close two stimuli occur together in time. So if the time between presenting the neutral stimulus, the thing that does not elicit a natural response, and the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that does elicit a natural response, is too long, no association will be made. And you really won't develop a conditioned stimulus or response. So the shorter the time, the stronger the association. I accidentally classically conditioned my dog. He had eye surgery, so after I would give him his medication, I would give him a treat. And now every time I give him his medication, if I forget to give him a treat, he just follows me around until I give him one. You also have contingency. So that's the extent of the neutral stimulus becoming reliably associated with the unconditioned stimulus. So strong contingency is when you're consistent in presenting the neutral stimulus, the thing that doesn't elicit a response naturally, and the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that does naturally elicit the response. Such as Pavlov consistently ringing a bell and then presenting food to the dog. If he inconsistently presented food here and there after ringing the bell, then the conditioned response would be rather weak or non-existent, and the same goes for the development of a conditioned stimulus. Now, there is a table in this slide, and I will preface that the table below is using the term CS, or conditioned stimulus. This is because the conditioned stimulus is when the neutral stimulus is being paired with the unconditioned stimulus, and the table is actually referring to that process, but it's technically the neutral stimulus, just so we don't get too confused. But if you look at the table, it goes through different ways that the neutral stimulus or conditioned stimulus gets paired with the unconditioned stimulus and how it can yield certain responses and results. So we have first and second order classical conditioning, and these actually occur very frequently in our everyday life. First order is when you have that unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. So it's basically the stimulus that naturally brings about a response without any conditioning needing. It's the cold breeze that causes us to shiver and get goosebumps. So we all have those very natural responses that happen all the time. The other one is second order or higher order. This is where classical conditioning will occur on top of a pre-existing classical conditioning. So you have a conditioned stimulus, something you've learned to respond to in a certain way, becoming associated with a new unconditioned stimulus or natural response. So a lot of times it'll occur on top of the first order. So some examples are drug cravings. So you might have someone who takes heroin and they become high. So here you have the person taking heroin and then becoming high. It's a very unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. But then this individual consistently takes heroin in a specific room or with specific people. They now become a neutral stimulus. They're not really eliciting any sort of response at all. Right now, they're just people or rooms. But you start to get a new conditioned stimulus, the feeling of being high paired with the people and or rooms. So that individual then starts having drug cravings, this conditioned response, when they are in those rooms or around those people. Another example is seeing a bear. So you become afraid and run away. So you have the bear as the unconditioned stimulus and the fear and running away as the unconditioned response. It's a very natural thing to happen. But one day you see a bear while walking on a trail you frequently go to. Now you might develop a fear of that trail. So that trail, being a once neutral stimulus, didn't really elicit any fear at all, has been paired with the unconditioned stimulus of the bear, the animal that elicits a natural fear response, and you now have that trail being a conditioned stimulus or something that you conditionally respond to with fear. You can also classically condition emotions and physiological responses. Emotions are actually classically conditioned all the time. You might develop a phobia of something due to a negative experience, or learn to fear your parent when they give you, quote unquote, that look that means you're in trouble. So, one thing with emotions is called stimulus generalization. So, a stimulus similar to the conditioned stimulus, or a thing we've learned to have a certain response to, can elicit that conditioned response even though they've never been paired with the unconditioned stimulus, or the thing that brings about the response naturally. So some children learn they get rewarded when they clean their bedroom, so they generalize this by cleaning other parts of the house to obtain more rewards. Or you can see this in people with PTSD. War veterans experience moments of heightened trauma during fireworks because they can sound and sometimes look like explosions experienced during war. You also see it with marketing, in which some brands have very similar packaging to popular brands, and you generalize that's a popular brand and will buy it. We also have stimulus discrimination. So the conditioned response, that response we've learned, occurs in response to a particular conditioned stimulus, but it does not occur in response to other stimuli that are similar to this conditioned stimulus. So a child might say hello to their teacher, but not to a stranger, because they have been taught to discriminate who is safe to talk to. Or you see this in cognitive behavioral therapy, where in some instances people are taught how to distinguish between different thoughts, situations, and emotions and so forth, so that they can work on reducing how much they overgeneralize their negative thoughts. Now, physiological responses have taste aversion. That's nausea is paired with a certain food, and one becomes conditioned to feel ill at the sight, smell, or idea of it. If you've ever experienced food poisoning, this is a very common way to develop taste aversion. But some people have sensory issues, which is commonly seen in autism, and taste aversion can develop from this. There's also what we call avoidant restrictive food disorder, or ARFID, and that's an eating disorder where people are very selective eaters to the point of having poor nutrition or nutritional deficiencies. So maybe someone only eats mashed potatoes, so you put peas in the mashed potatoes and eventually work your way up to putting steak bits or chicken bits in as a way to introduce new foods. We also have biological preparedness. So some believe genes give us the ability to learn taste aversion easily. Biological preparedness is possibly a way we can just easily learn how to avoid harmful things. We also have aversion therapy. It uses classical conditioning to condition people to avoid certain things. So you see this with people who want to stop biting their nails. So they'll use specific nail polish that has like an unpleasant taste to hopefully dissuade them from biting their nails. There's also a drug you can use with those who struggle with alcoholism. It's called a disulfiram, and it usually causes you to feel extremely ill if you end up drinking alcohol. Now, there is what we call conditioned compensatory response. So that's a learned reaction that will counteract the effects of something. You see this a lot with drugs, where a physiological response is triggered when certain cues are there, such as specific people or places, and the body will actually prepare sometimes to offset the expected impact it believes the drug will cause. So there is extinction and counterconditioning, which is similar to unlearning. First, it starts with acquisition. So that's the learning curve for the conditioned response and the extinction curve for the conditioned response. So basically, it's how difficult or easy something might be to learn or unlearn. With extinction, that is when you are removing the conditioned response. So what you're doing is you can present the conditioned stimulus to the participant without presenting the unconditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's case, that would be maybe he's ringing the bell, but he's never presenting the food. This is very much impacted by the context in which extinction takes place, and reacquiring a response can occur more easily when you go back to learn it. There's also a spontaneous recovery. So that's where a response that's been extinguished actually may reappear and strengthen over a very brief period before going away again. It can occur at any time during extinction, and you're more likely to have this response when a response is extinguished immediately after being learned. So maybe you worked to extinguish your aversion to a food that caused food poisoning, but shortly after you have some periods where you think of that food and feel super sick, but it doesn't last too long and you re-enter extinction. You also have counter conditioning. So that's conditioning a different incompatible response to the unconditioned stimulus or the thing that naturally brings about a response. So maybe you're afraid of dogs because you had an experience that conditioned you to that fear. With counter conditioning, you might be encouraged to pair a positive experience with dogs, such as doing an activity that brings happiness, and then immediately after you interact with a dog. This could help reduce those fears. Another type of learning we have is called operant conditioning, which is we learn through the consequences of our behaviors. This initially comes from E.L. Thorndike, who locked a cat in a box and placed food outside of it. The cat had to find a way to get out by activating a mechanism in the box that would release it. He then repeated the experiment multiple times and found the cat's behavior started to change and it slowly became less agitated when in the box, and the time it took to get out started to reduce. He basically saw animals choose to respond to the environment in certain ways, and each choice creates a consequence. So he proposed this law of effect, which basically states behaviors leading to positive consequences will be strengthened and behaviors leading to negative consequences will be weakened. So basically, think back to when you were a child and how your parents may have tried to strengthen what they believed were positive behaviors and weaken what they believed were negative. There is reinforcement, so that is the strengthening responses that lead to a positive or pleasant consequence. And there's punishment, weakening responses that lead to a negative or unpleasant consequence. B.F. Skinner was the one who introduced the term operant conditioning originally because he noticed that in classical conditioning, a response is typically forced or a respondent behavior develops. Whereas in operant conditioning, it really emphasizes a choice is made to respond to the environment in a certain way, so we learn to operate accordingly. Now we'll talk a bit about those consequences or punishments with behavior. So we have reinforcements which increase behavior and punishments which are aimed to decrease behavior. Reinforcements are comprised of positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when the behavior leads to the addition of something pleasant. So you do well at work and you get a bonus or a raise. Negative reinforcement is not a punishment in terms of psychology. This is when the behavior is rewarded by the removal of something unpleasant. So because of how well you do at work, maybe the requirements for paperwork are reduced. Now, punishment can be positive or negative, just like reinforcement. But with punishment, the positive punishment would be a behavior results in the addition of something unpleasant because we're wanting to decrease a behavior. So you're not doing well at work, you get written up and placed on a probationary period where you must follow specific steps and meet certain targets to keep your job. You're getting things added. Negative punishment is when the behavior leads to the removal of something pleasant. Maybe because you're not doing well at work, after some time, you actually might lose your job. So there is acquisition and extinction with operant conditioning. Like classical conditioning, there are learning curves to acquire and extinguish behaviors or how difficult or easy this might be. We also have extinction where in this case, reinforcements are being discontinued and behaviors actually tend to disappear. And the extinction burst is when the behaviors may increase after a situation changes to force the reinforcement to resume. So a lot of times by not rewarding behavior, extinction can happen rapidly, but it requires consistency. If there's inconsistency in extinction, such as only removing reinforcements here and there, then our behaviors are not fully extinguished, and we learn where we can get away with certain things and who we can do that with. Many times we think of children during this. They may throw tantrums when they are not getting their way. Some parents may engage in reinforcement to get the child to stop crying, but it creates a rather negative response moving forward. whereas some parents may ignore the tantrum and the child learns that their response is not the appropriate behavior in certain instances and stop. Obviously, every child, parent, and their situations are different, so this is not applicable to all child-parent relationships. So there are different schedules of reinforcement. So that's the frequency and timing of reinforcements that are given. One of them is continuous reinforcement, and that falls under a schedule where each instance of a desired behavior is rewarded. Typically does not modify the behavior, and a lot of times it's unrealistic and very vulnerable to extinction because you can't be around a person every single time they do a desired behavior to reinforce it, nor can the same occur for you. Plus, if you take a reinforcement away when it's been presented so consistently, there's no motivation to continue the behavior anymore because we learned that this behavior should always lead to a reinforcement. There's actually a debate between participation awards with this, where participation awards are when children and even adults are awarded some sort of reward for participating in an activity. While it can lead to positive reinforcement for trying out new things, some find that once the participation reward is removed, the individual's learned behavior to try new activities become extinguished. I actually saw this happen frequently when I did therapy with children. And then there's partial reinforcements, which is a schedule where rewards are only given on some instances of a desired behavior. Now, we do look at ratio schedules, which are partial reinforcements. You have a fixed ratio schedule, which is where rewards are given only during certain instances of a desired behavior, so extinction is a little slower. So for example, at work you get paid a bonus for every 15 sales you make, or you get paid per product you sell. In therapy, therapists who are in private practice typically get paid per client they see. You also have a variable ratio schedule, so the number of responses needed for a reward will vary, and extinction is usually even slower than a fixed ratio. So maybe you need to make 5 sales for a certain bonus, 10 sales for a different bonus, and then 15 sales for a significant bonus. You also have interval schedules, which are part of the partial reinforcement as well, where a fixed interval is rewards are given for the first instance of a desired response, and a set amount of time passes before another reward will be given, during which the behavior stops. So you can only receive a bonus at work during your yearly review, which is the same time once a year. So you just put on extra work a few months before in hopes of obtaining the reward. With variable interval, this is very similar to fixed interval, but the length of time will vary. It usually produces a steady rate of response, and behaviors are more resistant to extinction than those with a fixed interval. So you may have multiple reviews throughout the year at work, but they are not announced until the end of the week before they are starting. In this case, you might be motivated to put in a certain quality of work because you never quite know when the reviews are coming and you want that reward, as opposed to the fixed interval where you always know when the reviews are coming, so you get to pick and choose when you put in the quality work. So you can also learn through discrimination, generalization, and shaping. Discrimination is learning to distinguish among similar stimulus, so a response is given in the instance known to produce the reinforcement. So maybe you do your work at school and at your job because it produces some sort of reward, but you won't do other people's work. With generalization, the learned operant behavior is given in response to different but similar stimuli. So you have a way you organize your workload at school and home, which you then try out at work to see if it produces the same results. With shaping, you'll build new behavior by rewarding successive approximations. So you're giving rewards to behavior that is similar to the desired behavior, or you're breaking down the desired behavior and rewarding those broken down instances in a stepping stone way. As students, we sometimes need to work on improving our study habits. One student might specifically need to sit down and study. So they might start by rewarding themselves for studying a certain amount of minutes, such as taking a break or having a treat. It then goes to rewarding themselves for studying a certain amount of hours, then days, and eventually leading to having a reward when a certain grade is obtained. Usually they find themselves engaging in studying more easily and may only seek a reward when the grade is obtained. It does lead to what we call extinctive drift, which is a learned behavior is abandoned for a more instinctive one. You usually see this though in animals when you train a cat or dog to not do something, which might work when they see the punishment you use, but their instincts can be stronger and they'll do the negative behavior anyway, or only when they do not see the punishment or you not around to punish them. There is also behavior modification, so learning to modify problematic behaviors. I use this a lot in my work with clients, especially couples. We will learn new ways of interacting with each other that are much more productive and establish the desired dynamics they want in the relationship. They usually are inspired to keep with the new behaviors, as difficult, unnatural, and awkward as it might be in the beginning, because of the positive changes they see, which helps motivate them to stick with the work they're putting in to obtain their end goals. So now that we know more about how we can learn behaviors in operant conditioning, we are left with deciding on whether to punish or to reinforce. Not all punishments and rewards are created equal. Many things depend on context, and we really need to be very aware of what we are doing and why. So for reinforcement to be effective, you need to model the behaviors you desire. There's a saying that goes, "It's okay for me, but not for thee." Well, no. That's hypocritical and leads to people not engaging in the desired behaviors. Many people naturally look at situations and think, why should I engage in this behavior if this person isn't? With punishment, it's kind of the same as reinforcement. It's not guaranteed to work every time, but the catch is that it can sometimes have more negative consequences. Sometimes punishment inhibits people from learning how to effectively express or manage themselves in a situation because the punishment does not give them the chance to an alternative behavior. And a lot of times, alternative behaviors are not explained. As for physical punishment, I've seen that when working with children in therapy, they absolutely can develop aggressive behaviors. Some kids would come in with the parent concerned about them hitting their siblings or classmates when upset, and come to find out the parent does the same to the child when upset. This can also happen with adults who do not develop other skill sets to manage emotions or situations as time goes on. Punishment can sometimes result in behavior change. You think of children who get something taken away when they misbehave because maybe reinforcement just isn't working. But in other instances, some people get punished by having to do chores, so they view chores as a negative consequence rather than an everyday responsibility we must all do in life, and might only behave when the parent is around. As for emotional reactions, yes, punishment can lead to that, but there's a difference between a punishment of losing our job because we did not do our work versus receiving punishments that teach us to fear people in life. There are obviously a lot of debates over physical punishment as well, and physical punishment also exists for adults, and you usually see it in domestically violent relationships. Usually alternatives though with children to physical punishment tend to be explaining and reinforcing appropriate behaviors, or maybe people are trying to use punishment that really punishes, such as the loss of a privilege, or maybe trying to remain calm while punishing. Not always the easiest to do at times, or sometimes punishment occurs every time the bad behavior occurs. So you have different options, but like I always say, everyone's context is different. And like we talked about earlier, there's a lot of different ways and reasons we go about doing things, and we need to just be very aware of what we're doing and why. Within operant conditioning, we also have primary and secondary reinforcers. So primary reinforcers are rewards that's reinforcing in and of itself, and it does not have to be learned or associated with another reward. So maybe food, water, sleep, vacation, praise, entertainment, shelter, and so forth. These are naturally motivating and reinforcing for us. Secondary reinforcers are rewards that gain its value by association or leading to a primary reinforcer. So maybe you get good grades because it leads to someone being proud of you. We also have a token economy, so tokens of some sort are received and can be used later for some sort of primary reinforcer. So some companies allow you to earn made up money at work to trade in for extra days off or a physical item. We also have delay of gratification, so learning to forego immediate reinforcement in favor of waiting for a later, sometimes larger reinforcement. If you save your money rather than spending it right away, you could go on a vacation possibly. So there are different cognitions or ways of thinking in classical and operant conditioning. One of them is insight learning. So this is the realization of how a problem can be solved after studying it for a period of time. It can also be recognizing that there are functional relationships between things in a given situation, and you can apply that understanding to create a solution for the present. Or maybe learning can be purposeful and goal directed or motivated. Usually, insight learning has three general properties. There's the impasse, so a solution emerges after failed attempts and is not a result of methodical trial and error. You have restructuring, so the solution involves a restructuring of the problem in a novel way. And then the aha moment, the solution could just suddenly appear. So an example is you try to figure out a math problem, recreate a recipe, or are stuck between which job offers to accept. And then after break, sleep, or hearing someone say something, you then have an answer. Latent learning is learning that's not directly observed through behavior. The learning is usually evident when it's time to demonstrate the learning. And you have this cognitive map where maybe you're observing your environment and creating a mental representation that assists you in learning and task completion. So you learn certain routines and habits from your parents, even though they never explicitly told you to do something a certain way. Maybe your parents clean their dishes in a particular fashion by chance. The last type of learning we'll go over is observational learning. So this is learning through observation and then imitation or modeling of others' behaviors. The learning can occur without directly observable change in a behavior, and cognition that we just talked about is highly considered in this. Sometimes this type of learning is called social learning or modeling because of the social nature of it. Albert Bandura did a famous study on this in the 60s, which I will preface was before we really had those ethical guidelines, and there's a video for you all to watch on this in your module this week. There is a 4-step process of observational learning though. It's attention. The observer must first pay attention to the modeler's behavior before they can imitate it. Retention and memory, to where we must retain a memory of the model's behavior. We then reproduce the behavior, so we must have a mental representation stored that can be retrieved and used to reproduce the behavior. And then motivation. We need to be motivated to execute the behavior. So an example is you see a lot of children, even middle school and high school, imitating behaviors of their peers, what they see on TV, and the behavior of their parents. However, some behaviors are never executed because we realize that punishments can occur, or how certain behaviors might be hurtful to others. And that is the end of this lecture.